courtroom was engulfed in deep silence. The jury members were taking notes, while the attorneys and journalists waited eagerly for the trial to begin. But in the middle of the room, the face of the man sitting at the defendant's table was filled with fear and desperation. The defendant, Darnell Brooks, a 32-year-old black man, had never had a criminal record in his life. He was an ordinary working-class citizen, yet today he was being treated as if he were a career criminal. Judge Olivia Carter slammed her gavel firmly on the desk.
Order in the court. Defendant Darnell Brooks, please step forward.
Darnell stood up. He clenched his fists tightly, trying to keep his composure. This had to be a nightmare.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today to convict a thief. According to security footage, Darnell Brooks broke into an electronics store on the night of May 8th and emptied the cash register. The footage is clear, and the evidence is undeniable.
On the screen, the security footage played. The suspect indeed looked a lot like Darnell. Murmurs spread across the courtroom.
This is ridiculous. I was at home that night, having dinner with my wife. How is it that I can't prove that?
Oh, of course. We've heard that excuse before. But I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks, with security footage like this, your "I didn't do it" claim doesn't mean much.
Mr. Wallace, it's interesting how certain you are of my client's guilt, but have you considered the possibility that this footage has been tampered with?
Prosecutor Wallace's face tensed for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure.
Attorney Harris, are you suggesting that the entire police department is conspiring against your client? Is it so hard to accept the truth?
As the tension in the courtroom rose, Darnell's attorney, Naomi, glanced down at the file in her hand and smirked, because she knew that only half the truth had been revealed so far, and she was about to uncover an even bigger secret. While Prosecutor Wallace continued speaking with confidence, Naomi Harris remained silent for a moment. She was waiting for the perfect time to present her evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have crystal clear security footage from the store. The suspect's face and clothing are clearly visible. To deny Darnell Brooks' guilt would be like denying the existence of the sun.
Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jury members examined the footage carefully.
The man in that video is not me. Look at him. He doesn't even have a beard, but I do.
Naomi immediately stood up.
Mr. Wallace, have you taken a close look at the timestamp on the security footage?
A murmur rippled through the room.
What are you implying?
Naomi turned to the jury, placing her hands firmly on the table.
We had a forensic expert analyze this footage, and they discovered something shocking. The video was actually recorded 2 days before the alleged crime took place.
A stunned silence filled the courtroom before chaos erupted. Judge Olivia Carter slammed her gavel down forcefully.
Order in the court. Attorney Harris, can you prove these claims?
Naomi held up a document and presented it to the jury.
Yes, Your Honor. An independent forensic analysis shows that the timestamp on the security footage was altered. In other words, this so-called evidence is a fraud.
Prosecutor Wallace's face turned pale, but he wasn't ready to give up.
This could be an error, but the suspect's DNA was found at the crime scene.
Naomi took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for.
And are we certain that DNA actually belongs to Darnell Brooks?
Tension in the courtroom reached its peak, because Naomi was about to reveal that even the so-called DNA evidence had been manipulated. And when she exposed who was behind this fabricated evidence, the entire courtroom would be in shock. The courtroom held its breath. Defense attorney Naomi Harris clutched the document in her hand and turned to the jury. Up until now, everyone believed the security footage was the strongest piece of evidence. But now, she was suggesting that even the DNA found at the crime scene was suspicious.
This is complete nonsense. The defendant's DNA was found at the crime scene. What more proof do we need?
Naomi smirked and pulled out a document from her file. She then turned to the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I hold in my hands the forensic report on the DNA evidence from the crime scene, and we have discovered something very interesting. And what is that detail, Attorney Harris?
Naomi handed the report to the jury and projected a chart onto the screen.
Is the DNA found at the crime scene really from Darnell Brooks? Our forensic experts discovered that the sample appears to have been processed in a lab before being submitted. In other words, the evidence may have been planted.
A wave of shock swept through the courtroom. Prosecutor Wallace's face tensed.
What does this mean? Someone set me up.
Naomi narrowed her eyes and continued.
What this means, Mr. Brooks, is that while DNA was found, the real question is, did you actually leave it there, or did someone else plant it?
The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Judge Carter slammed her gavel.
Order in the court. Prosecutor Wallace, how do you respond to these allegations?
A bead of sweat rolled down Wallace's forehead. He shuffled through his files, but he had no real answer.
This is impossible. The DNA samples were tested in a police lab, and
Just then, Naomi dropped the final bombshell.
And when we examined the lab reports, we found out who conducted the DNA tests.
The jury members sat up in their seats, anticipation thick in the air. Naomi stepped forward and projected a new document onto the screen.
The person who handled these DNA tests was none other than Detective Logan Pierce, the very same officer who arrested Darnell Brooks.
The courtroom exploded. Journalists frantically took notes. Jury members exchanged stunned glances.
What? The officer who arrested me was the one who ran my DNA test?
this is purely coincidental. Detective Pierce is a respected officer.
No, Mr. Wallace, this is no coincidence. We have records showing that Detective Pierce has altered evidence in multiple past cases.
The entire courtroom was on the verge of chaos. All eyes turned toward Prosecutor Wallace. But one question hung in the air. Did the police fabricate evidence? The courtroom was at its boiling point. The name, Detective Logan Pierce, had been brought up, and now everyone's eyes were on Prosecutor Wallace.
Order in the court. Prosecutor Wallace, how do you respond to these accusations against Detective Pierce?
Wallace's face turned red. He gripped the table, taking a deep breath.
This is outrageous. Detective Pierce has served honorably for years. He would never do something like this.
Naomi smirked. Because she had one final, game-changing piece of evidence.
Tell me, Mr. Wallace, do you even know where Detective Pierce is right now?
Wallace frowned. Just then, a uniformed officer entered the courtroom and handed a document to Judge Carter.
Has an official investigation been opened against Detective Pierce?
Naomi nodded, then turned to the jury.
Yes, Your Honor. Detective Pierce entered the department's security footage database just days before Darnell Brooks was arrested. And not just that, our investigation shows that he was the one who altered the timestamp on the security footage.
The jury members' eyes widened. The room buzzed with whispers.
So this was a setup from the start. They targeted me.
You can't prove that.
On the contrary, Mr. Wallace, we have proof. A technician from the forensic lab has come forward, admitting that Pierce pressured them into altering the DNA test results.
Wallace's face turned pale.
These are serious allegations. Prosecutor Wallace, do you have anything to say in your defense?
Wallace averted his eyes. Just then, another police officer entered the courtroom and announced that Detective Pierce had been taken into custody.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client, Darnell Brooks, was being framed for a crime he did not commit. Today, we have exposed fabricated evidence and the corruption within the justice system.
The jury exchanged glances. They now knew the truth.
The court orders the immediate arrest of Detective Pierce and a full reevaluation of all evidence. This trial is adjourned until further investigation.
Darnell Brooks took a deep breath. He had fought for his freedom. But most importantly, the truth had finally come to light. The courtroom was on the brink of chaos. An official investigation had been launched against Detective Logan Pierce, and the evidence-tampering accusations were now backed by solid proof. The jury members whispered among themselves, struggling to process the shocking revelations. For the first time since the trial had begun, Darnell Brooks took a deep breath. But something still felt off.
This is unacceptable. This court has been manipulated.
Manipulated? The only manipulation here was orchestrated by your people, Mr. Wallace. My client spent weeks locked up for a crime he didn't commit, but today, justice prevails. Order in the court. Prosecutor Wallace, the allegations against Detective Pierce are serious and well supported. Based on the overwhelming evidence, this court finds Darnell Brooks not guilty.
A wave of relief washed over the courtroom. Some spectators even clapped.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney Harris.
Naomi smiled and placed a hand on Darnell's shoulder. She was proud, not just for winning, but for exposing corruption. But Prosecutor Wallace's face turned red with fury. His breath grew heavy, and his eyes locked onto Darnell.
I will not let a criminal like you walk free.
Suddenly, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Wallace lunged at Darnell, his fist clenched, raised in the air. He was about to strike.
Stand back! Prosecutor Wallace, stop!
In an instant, two court officers rushed forward and grabbed Wallace's arms. The entire courtroom gasped. Judge Carter slammed her gavel furiously.
An assault attempt in my courtroom. Prosecutor Ethan Wallace, you are hereby placed under arrest for contempt of court, assault attempt, and abuse of power.
The officers quickly handcuffed Wallace. But even as they restrained him, Wallace thrashed violently, screaming at Darnell.
This system is rigged. This is a setup. Everyone is against me. You're a criminal, Brooks. People like you should never walk free.
No, Mr. Wallace. The real mistake was allowing corrupt people like you to manipulate the system. But now it's over.
Wallace was dragged out of the courtroom, still ranting like a madman. The air inside the courtroom suddenly felt lighter.
Darnell Brooks, this court clears you of all charges. You are free.
Darnell lowered his head, his eyes filled with emotion.
I never thought this day would come, but now I know. Justice still exists.
Naomi turned to the jury with a determined look.
Today, we witness the flaws in our system, but with the right people fighting for truth, justice will always prevail.
The entire courtroom stood up. Journalists scrambled to write down the scandal that had just unfolded. Darnell had won his freedom, but more importantly, he had proven his innocence. And this time, justice had punished the real criminal. Is it over, or is this just the beginning? Alert.